Hi, everyone, and welcome to Literary Terms Part 2. We're talking about the literary elements that we're going to be looking at throughout our course. And in particular, we're going to really be focusing on literary elements used in fiction. There are more lectures about drama and then about poetry later on in the class. So let's get to it. The first thing I want to talk about is what was just pictured, figurative language. So literal language occurs when a word's meaning is literally the same as its definition. Figurative language occurs when a word is used outside of its definition. So instead of saying I could literally eat a horse right now, you really should be saying I could figuratively eat a horse. But you don't want to say that because then you'd sound like a jerk. But for example, he went outside the box. By using this term, it's an idiom, something that's a piece of figurative language that we all kind of use very often. We know he's not moving outside an actual physical box, right? It means that he's thinking in a unique or different way. So by using figurative language, writers can evoke emotion and imagery from their writing that literal language just can't really provide. And we're going to be talking about some of the things that we see here on the right-hand side as we go. And a couple of them there, alliteration, assonance, we're going to save, and onomatopoeia, we save for when we talk about poetry. So, personification is giving personality to inanimate objects or abstract ideas. This is different than anthropomorphism, where like you have a talking horse, right? It's more of like a horse gives you a look and it's kind of like how a person would look at you. Oxymoron is where we have a pair of contradictory words, organized chaos, jumbo shrimp, something like that. Paradox is a self-contradictory statement, something that cannot seem to exist. It contradicts itself. Hyperbole is exaggeration. Simile is a comparison of two things using like or as, and metaphor is a direct comparison. So metaphor, Noah is a lion, or Noah has the heart of a lion. Simile, on her first day of school, Jane was as cool as a cucumber. That's the difference there. And a lot of these, again, we'll talk about in more depth when we get to poetry. But I'd like you to know the terms even for short fiction, because sometimes we do see these techniques used in our stories. So, imagery. Imagery includes sensory details in a work. So types of imagery, I love this picture. Auditory, what we hear, music, silence, noise. Cacophony means like disorganized noise. A melody, the crunch of gravel underneath your feet. Visual, what we see, colors, patterns, shapes, and size. So the large blue wooden roll-top desk that always sat in the corner of my grandfather's office, right? Describing the shape and the color and the material there as well. Visual. Tactile describes what we touch or feel, so texture, movement, temperature. A fuzzy blanket, the cool snow, the way someone looks when they're running versus jogging. Gustatory is what we taste, sour, sweet, acidic, bitter, and salty. And olfactory, what we smell. What's interesting, I think I mentioned this in another lecture, that we don't have a lot of olfactory imagery because I think that fragrance and odor is kind of hard to describe. It's and it's also the sense that's actually most connected to memory. But one of the things I'd like you to think about as we talk about writing is first, sort of the base level is identification. Where is imagery being used? The second is, why is imagery being used, or how is imagery being used? So how does the writer use the tactile descriptions to build the mood? How does their tone, which we talked about mood and tone before, how does their tone change when they're talking about some of the things that they're hearing? The tone of a person's voice when you first fall in love versus when you fall out of love, right? Things of that nature. Symbolism. I think symbolism is the thing that people struggle with the most. Symbols are concrete objects that stand for abstract subjects. So a lot of times we have an object or an image that has a meaning of its own, but it has a secondary meaning as well. For example, a heart is an organ that pumps blood in your body, but for the most part, we think of a heart symbolizing love. The color green can sometimes represent envy. Seasons sometimes represent a lifespan. We're going to talk about a poem where it has to do with a snowy evening. Snow and winter is kind of often associated with the end of life. So here we have a thing, I think this is from a game. Gold is generosity and respect. Red is strength. Silver is peace. Blue is joy and innocence. Oh no, that's silver too. I think the blue got cut off. And maroon is victorious in battle and patient in battle. Those are shields that represent those different attributes, right? Sometimes a symbol can be established, as I said, like the heart, or green with envy is a thing we often say or we often use. The meaning is derived outside of the story. It's just something that's relatively well known. He marches to the beat of his own drummer. The drummer and marching symbolize him having thoughts that are outside the norm, right? Those are common things that we associate with that. A private or personal symbol is defined only in the context of the story, the poem, or the play in which it appears. So it really wouldn't take on any significance outside of the story. For example, in a poem, the speaker could be talking about his shadow in a spiritual way, although shadows are not usually spiritual. A lion may mean courage and strength. A rabbit, we talk about people getting it on like rabbits. Rabbits sometimes represent fertility. We're as quick as a squirrel. We're as cunning as a snake. We're running as free as a horse, right? Those are some common understandings. Now, a private or personal understanding here in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the lion does sort of stand for courage and strength, as is, the king of the jungle. That's the established meaning of a lion. But in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you've ever read it, or watched the movie, but if you've ever read the book, the lion is really supposed to represent a figure from the Bible. So there's a religious allusion there, which we'll talk about allusions more later. But there's a religious allusion there and a private context for that symbol. And it's not really outside of the story in which it appears. Irony. Irony has a range of meanings. The first is it really shouldn't be confused with sarcasm. Sometimes sarcasm is a small type of irony, and I think that people think that, you speak sarcastically and you're being ironic. Well, not really. Sarcasm is used to insult or cause emotional pain, essentially. And sometimes it's meant to be funny, but there's always something kind of hurtful in the funny, right? But irony really, and I'd like you to really remember this definition. It's used to suggest the difference between appearance and reality, or between expectation and fulfillment. So we expect the characters to do something. It seems like the story we're reading is a romance. We expect them to fall in love, and then suddenly one of them ironically dies, right? That's something that is fulfilled that we were not, as the audience, we were not expecting. Dramatic irony. It's an unsinkable ship. What could go wrong, says the tugboat of the Titanic, pulling it out to sea. This is going to be a wonderful trip. So dramatic irony happens when the writer lets the audience know something the characters don't know to create humor or to create suspense. The other types of irony, verbal irony, here the discrepancy or the contrast is between what is said and what is meant. In dramatic irony, as I just said, the discrepancy between what the readers know and what the character does not know. Situational irony is the discrepancy between appearance and reality, or expectation and fulfillment. So verbal irony, nothing is written in stone. There's something, there's a discrepancy or a contrast there between saying that nothing is written in stone and having a stone with that saying written upon it. This is dramatic irony from a horror film where she's on her computer. The audience knows that the killer is in the house, but she does not. Now, I will say that I think if you were an intelligent woman, you might see the reflection of the killer in your computer screen, but maybe you're not looking that closely. Nevertheless, it's the discrepancy between what she knows or does not know and what we do know. Theme. So, sometimes you may have been taught by other people that the theme is the moral of the story, and this is just not correct. Instead, a theme does provide the readers with a better understanding of life, but that really has more to do with the author's message. Themes are fundamental and universal ideas explored in a literary work. Abstract concepts. They're central or dominating ideas in a work of literature. So, for example, we're going to be looking at Louisa May Alcott's My Contraband. One of the themes in that is racism, institutional racism or slavery. And slavery, sorry. So the theme is racism, but the message is not racism, right? The message is what the author has to say about that theme. So, for example, themes could be the powers of addiction, the difficulties of motherhood, rituals of society. If you are reading the Rocking Horse winner this semester, I think you're not, but I switch readings up a lot. So if you're reading that, luck is a central theme. If you're reading Cathedral, the power of addiction and alcohol is kind of an important part of the story. It's a motif or something that repeats in the story. A theme might be friendship, or a theme might be ignorance. So the message sometimes tied to the theme. So if a theme is if the message is what the author is trying to say about life or human nature, or the dominant theme in their work. So, for example, if the theme is addiction, the message might be addiction affects an entire family and not just the addict. Another message with addiction might be addiction can ruin your life, or a person can overcome addiction if they have help, right? Something like that. But the theme and the message, they're connected, but they are two different things. Rituals in society might be another theme. If I've assigned you the lottery to read, people following rituals blindly. So people should not follow rituals blindly, but should question authority. This is a thing from My Contraband, and that's a picture from The Minister's Veil. So The Minister's Black Veil, if you're reading that this semester, there are themes there of alienation, isolation, faith, right? So what is the author trying to say about those themes? My Contraband, as I mentioned, is a story that involves racism, and a story that involves families. It's a story that involves the wartime, right? So those are major themes in the work. What is the author trying to say? Really, that's sort of the central question for this class. One of the central questions, at least. What's happening in the story first? Identifying what is happening in the story, and then what literary elements is the author using to develop the story. And then what's the author's theme, what's the message, and how have they used some of those literary elements to develop that message? What I'd like you to do, how is the message developed? What I'd like you to do is think about how the author develops a message through some literary elements. So the things that we've been talking about in this lecture and in the previous lecture: plot, dialogue, characterization, imagery, and symbolism. How does the author develop the themes, and then what are they trying to say about those themes? So again, first identify the elements which are prominent in the story. Where are they used? Then consider the author's message and how the elements were used to convey that message. What's the problem? What does the character do about the problem? What does the character learn? What does the author want us to learn? Sometimes if you go through that process, it's a really easy way to kind of determine what you think the message is. The thing is here that I really want to stress, there is not one particular answer for this. And sometimes people make fun of English for this reason. So I think the comic John Mulaney has a joke where you're like, I think that poet is gay. And your professor's like, half credit, right? Like you kind of came up with an idea there. And maybe they were, or maybe they weren't, and maybe it's not even in their poetry at all. But the idea with the message and interpreting the message, I always kind of say, like, you know, if you have a story that's set in 1800s and you have a theme that centers around family, perhaps, maybe I'm telling you what one of the major themes is, the trouble in families or dysfunctional families, okay? If you say something like, the author's message is to just show us dysfunctional families, not really, that's not probably going to really be the message, right? What are they actually, yes, there's a dysfunctional family in the story, but what are they trying to say about what causes that dysfunction? Now, if maybe one person is drinking and another person is, you know, struggling with depression, you can focus on either one of those two things as being the central problem. So, themes in literature. I like this little picture. Just remember that it's like a cream-filled cupcake. The filling is hidden inside the cupcake. Sometimes themes are hidden inside a book. I don't love this 100%. I don't think it's hidden, but I think the author is not going to say the theme of this story is. I think there may be one or two stories in your book that do that, like the moral of the story, if you're reading a fairy tale like from Hans Christian Andersen or something. But what does the author want the audience to realize? For example, in Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Riding Hood goes through the woods, she meets a wolf, she trusts the wolf, and he comes back and eats her and her grandmother. Now, they're saved by a huntsman, but still, the idea is appearances can sometimes be deceiving. Oops, sorry. Whoops, sorry. There we go, back into it. So the example that this person has written, appearances can sometimes be deceiving. You have proof for that in the story, the way that the wolf is described. So the imagery the author uses to describe the big bad wolf. He's charming, he seems kind, he comes up to her, he speaks in smooth words, right? But for Little Red Riding Hood, you could also say that one of the central messages there is don't go off the path. She meets the wolf because she leaves the path and goes into the forest. So listen to what your parents tell you to do. And you'd have the literary element there of conflict. The conflict is between her and the wolf, and the message is, and possibly between her and her mother as well. If she had listened to her mother and paid attention, she would not have strayed from the path and everything would have been fine. There's another message there that a man will come in and save the day. If you want to take a feminist interpretation, you have two women, one young and one old, who cannot defend themselves, and a hunter comes in and rescues them, right? So again, some characterization would be the way that you would support an interpretation for that. So I have another lecture talking about how to create a literary argument. And now that you have some of the terms and you know some of the elements that you're going to be discussing in your writing, in your papers, in your discussion boards, in your journals, you can take a look at how to create a literary argument and how I would like you to talk about some of these elements in a little bit more depth. And now that is all, and I look forward to reading your work. Thanks.